This is Joe Bosso, and I'm talking to guitar extraordinaire. Is that what we call you? Joe Satriani.
Wow, guitar extraordinaire. I like that. I've been called a lot of things, and some by you as well. But to this morning, I'll take that.
Well, we're going to talk about the 10 records that changed your life, but before we do that, you, of course, have your new album, Shockwave Supernova, and I was very struck when I saw this that it's the highest charting debut of your career, which is now going on 30 years. That's not supposed to happen, right?
I know, that's really crazy. I'm in that state of mind where every time I release a record, I think anything can happen. So, don't let it change the way you arrange the record or even conceive the record. Just follow your creativity and embrace that thing that is the total chaos of the music industry. And so it became real. The chaos became real, and all of a sudden, as you said, without expecting it, I get the highest charting debut of my career. So I'm very happy about that, and I'm thinking any of these things can happen at any time. Whether it is that you're like walking on stage and you decide to play something different and you get a completely different reaction from the audience, or it's coming up with a crazy idea for a concept record that you're going to lay on your audience with 15 songs, you should just go for it, And I think good things happen when you stretch yourself and you try new things and you bet on the audience. I guess that's the best way to put it.
Now, Shockwave Supernova is a concept record, but as you and I have talked about before, it's sort of not a concept record. It's not like Tommy or The Wall. It kind of inhabits a different realm all its own, right?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the fact that it has no lyrics takes it out of, it being taken as a concept record from most of the population, because that's what they're used to, especially with rock music, is that concept records have to have somebody singing and really, like Tommy, having songs that are quite literal, to the story. They're really just telling you what this is about. This is this character's name. This is who he is. This is what he or she does, something like that. There are, however, lots of concept records if you dip into classical and jazz. And, there's a lot of beautiful classical major pieces, and let's say if we just look at symphonies alone, that do come from, a point of view that it is a concept, that the composer is writing with a concept. But everybody, in modern music, we kind of forget about that, and we just assume, that it wasn't really that heavy a concept. This is, I think, shines a light on the power and the flexibility in instrumental music, regardless of what style it is or what country it comes from or how old it is. You and I could discover a piece of North African music and really love it, and it could represent, something we heard, when we were having a good time with friends or something, and it immediately becomes fixed in our hearts as that piece of music that represents that memory. We don't know that it was written about growing up in the desert and walking your cow from one village to another. But that's because there are no lyrics, or sometimes if we don't understand the language that they're singing in. So I approached it in the same way, and just like you said, it's a concept record, but in a way it's not, because I didn't want to hit people over the head with it, saying you have to follow the narrative in order to enjoy the music. That's got nothing to do with Shockwave Supernova. As a matter of fact, the spirit of the story is the fact that it's completely kind of a free-for-all, because that's kind of like, in my mind, that's what was happening with the character. He was freaking out because he realizes that he's an alter ego, that he's not real. He starts to plead his case from song one all the way to the end, and he's the one who's actually going through this crazy cathartic process. But just the thought that I would try to convince an audience that, first of all, they have to believe that I've got an alter ego that's taking over, and then, number two, that there's this conversation or argument going on between the alter ego and the real Joe, and that the alter ego is saying, look what I've done for you, look at all the cool things we did, and then he starts to realize all the bad things he did, and then he goes through soul searching, and then he agrees to dissolve and be reborn. That's just a bit crazy. even as I explain it over and over again to journalists, and I think I've tried to explain it to you before.
Oh, yes.
I realize it's a good thing there are no lyrics in this record.
Now, you recorded the record with your touring band the last couple of years, Mike Keneally, he's been with you a while,
Yeah.
but also Marco Miniman and Brian Beller. How does that change the energy in the studio from records you've made in which you maybe bring in some musicians that you haven't played with before? They're kind of coming in fresh.
Yeah, I came into this record with this, great set of touring experiences with Mark O'Brien and Mike. We got together at rehearsals for the Unstoppable tour, pretty much on faith. I toured with Mike a lot, and I kind of knew as much as you can with Mike Keneally what to expect. But I really didn't know what to expect with Marco and Brian. I hung around with Brian a bit when he was working with Steve, and I'd seen a lot of video information of Marco. So I knew they were great players, very versatile, and I just didn't know what they were going to do once they started playing my material. But it was immediately fun and also put me at ease. It's a funny thing, when you're like imagine, like you're a lead singer, you're standing in front of the band, and you depend on the band to like set the tone, to play the parts right and provide the right amount of energy, because you've got to ride on top of it with, if you're the singer.
Right.
And that's pretty much my position in the band. I may start a song off, with a riff here and there, but I immediately turn into the guy that floats on top of the band. So I'm looking for something that feels solid, but I'm looking also for something that's dangerous and crazy and will match the energy that I'm providing with melody and solo and noises and all that kind of stuff that I do. So that's what I got from those first rehearsals with Mark O'Brien and Mike, was that I realized, wow, this is a band that not only makes me feel so comfortable, but they're playing crazier than any other live band that I've played with before. They're just really charging forward, and they're taking every song and they're doing something new with it that I had never thought of, like in terms of directing a rhythm section. So I gave up doing that. I just kind of, we would take each song as it came, and I'd listen to what they did, and I thought, that sounds great, keep doing it. You imagine after 2 years of the touring, I thought, this is going to be great. I'm going to bring in these songs. We're going to get together at Skywalker, and every morning I'll say, now, here's this song, and it's about such and such.
Right.
So you guys do what you normally do with it and show me what's going to happen. And we wound up with these fantastic takes to choose from that had an enormous amount of variety, but also had those two elements that I mentioned earlier, which is it sounded very comfortable, but actually had this other dangerous element of pushing the idea of what rock guitar instrumental could do, how it could be presented. And this allowed the story, of Shockwave to be told, I think, in a more descriptive manner. And they were all of the same mind as I was, that we could be different on every song. And it certainly had to be done, but all three of them had to take, like the title track, it was one thing, All of My Life was another, Stars Race Across the Sky. I mean, it's really like three different bands when you think about it, but they were really up for the challenge of sounding like different rhythm sections every time we pulled up a new song. I mean, it made everything fun and exciting, and I think it made the album really pop.
Well, you have made, during your career, a lot of records that I think we can safely say changed some people's lives. We're going to move on to the 10 records that changed your life here. Without giving away any of the choices yet, do you find that the impact that these records have on you now is different or even more meaningful than when you first heard them?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. I mean, right off the top of my head, I think nothing can change that first moment, when you hear something. It's so tied to where you are physically, what's happening around you, and who you are as a person at that time. When I was thinking about these albums, I was thinking, well, this, my career as someone who loves music, a budding musician, started when I was extremely young, so that means my experiences aren't very intellectual, So, and it's really hard, I think, to remember, like an adult, how you were feeling when you were 5 or 6 years old and you heard something that overwhelmed you. But a lot of my musical experiences that have stuck with me that still feel like that they're still golden moments were in fact when I was a very young, unformed person. You know, pre-intellectual, pre-puberty, you know, just like a really young kid, but expressing a 100%, what would you call it, a metamorphosis, you know, feeling that, like, wow, I just heard something and I feel like my whole existence on the planet Earth is somehow different now. And I was, you know, thinking like the earliest, what could have been the earliest thing that I can actually remember, and I think it's actually 12 by 5 by the Rolling Stones. And that record, obviously all those records that I had before I started to get in my, I don't know, right before being a teenager maybe, were all records that were just around the house because my older sisters, my 3 older sisters, my older brother, were just having the greatest time listening to music and going to parties and going to clubs and things like that when I was too young. So I would just, you know, when they weren't looking or out of the house, I would, you know, walk into the room and see what was on the record player and start playing it.
You were like the kid in Almost Famous getting his sister's records under the bed.
Yes, exactly. I can really relate to that, you know, and so my siblings, in my mind, were the coolest people on the planet. So I just thought, wow, what are they listening to? This is like everything coming from their bedrooms was the coolest noise I ever heard ever. So as they went through an absolute crazy set of decades, you know, I suppose if you could say the late 50s through the early 70s, I was sort of witness to them going through all of it, and I sort of got all the records and hand-me-downs. As they moved on from the Stones' first record, it became mine, you know. Yeah. So on and so forth. So, but I have great memories of listening to the Stones 12 by 5 over and over again. It was on a portable record player. And I just, you know, I would just listen to the sound of the guitars, the reverb, the accent that they sang in, you know. They've got a heavy accent on that record. It wasn't like the Beatles, although that would be the other record.
Well, wait, so is 12 by 5 one of your choices?
Yes.
Okay, well, why don't we start with that? We'll start with 12 by 5, Rolling Stones. So that's one of the first ones, as you said. That was coming from your sister.
Yes, yeah. As a matter of fact, I was, as I started to, you know, mentally go through it, I was thinking, like, I got that album from, you know, Joan, I got that from Carol, then Marion gave me that record. I'm going, God, when did I get my own record? And that's what made me realize that I was getting into this music as a very young kid, before it was okay for me to go to the store and buy an album. You know, because first of all, I didn't have any money of my own to buy an album. Second of all, my parents weren't letting me go to the record store and pick out albums, you know. So this was all happening around me. I was still a kid that probably most of the time was riding my bicycle and coming back with dirt all over my face or something. Who knows what I was doing. I was just doing, you know, little kid stuff. But I had this other life, which is when I got home, I was deep into this music. And, I mean, I remember my friends thinking, like, you are really weird that you're listening to your older sister's music or your older brother's music. Like, why aren't you just interested in your bicycle and whatever, you know?
The Stones have always been a blues-based band, but on this one they're doing a lot of blues covers. Did you have any idea of what you were listening to at the time?
None.
Yeah.
I had no idea, no. Because of my generation, I was very much enamored with the sound of it, as well as much as I could understand from the lyrics. I mean, 90% of the lyrics went right over my head. I had no idea what they were talking about.
Sure.
I think even if you just look at the choruses, I'm not even really registering what they're singing about. To me, it's like grown-up music to a certain extent, especially at that age when 12 by 5 came out. So that's, you know, I'm under 10 years old. I'm whatever, 7 going on 8 or something like that. This is a totally different experience for me. And I'm just listening to the sound of their voices, the sound of the band, the guitars, the reverb, you know. This, to me, was I think the primary message was just the racket they were making. This drove me to become a drummer. You know,
oh, yeah.
You know, I don't know why I didn't decide I'm going to be a singer or I'm going to be a piano player or a sax player or bass player or guitar player. I focused on the drums as being the thing I wanted to do. And I wonder why. Why didn't I say, got to be the sax player, got to be the piano player or something? But that may have been the fact that a lot of the music I'm hearing, I'm experiencing by watching my family party to this music, or we're driving around in the car. Of course, I'm the youngest, so I'm always in the back seat somewhere. No one's really looking at me, and so I'm just taking in the whole event of my older siblings listening to this music.
Or it could have just been you were a kid and you wanted to hit things.
I think that's it was a good combination of the two.
Well, let's see. We have 12 by 5 by the Stones. What would the next record be?
At around the same time, I would say it would be with the Beatles. Again, these early records were all, were coming into the house all because of my older sisters. I think they were the perfect age for that record.
Now, you say with the Beatles, which of course is the original UK release. Did she actually have With the Beatles, or was it Meet the Beatles?
I think it was with the Beatles. I'm not really sure, to tell you the truth. It was, I just remember the cover, and of course all the material on there, that, again, very much like 12 by 5, was very British, so it was very exotic sounding to a little Italian-American kid from Long Island, right?
Yeah.
Even, it was just so crazy sounding. And of course, like with a song like Roll Over Beethoven, I knew that as American music, from Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry's music was in the house all the time, so all of a sudden I heard these guys singing. It was like, whoa, what foreign country are those guys from, But you have to imagine a young kid living in that time. Of course, would be overwhelmed with just the look, the marketing of the Beatles, the haircut, the four of them together, and just the intensity of the material. It was the Beatles came on so strong because the writing was super strong and very much tied into their whole look and sound. It was just the whole package was pretty overwhelming. Again, you can't discount the fact that it's not like I was a grown-up and I intellectually said, well, I've got these 20 releases to pick from, and these are the ones that I think have merit,
right,
artistically. It's nothing to do with that. It's just a little kid who, with a young body walking around in the mid-'60s, and being around my older siblings who are dancing with their friends and having parties and playing it loud in the car, while driving to the beach and all this kind of stuff, and hearing the excitement about them coming to America. It sounds funny to say it now, but that's kind of like it was a big deal.
It was a very big deal.
Yeah, so I'm influenced by that whole thing, and so I think I was swept up in the excitement of it, and I liked a lot of the other stuff that came along with it, like the Dave Clark 5.
Sure.
And great songs and just a lot of fun. Of course, I was too young to take, part of it. Truly, I wasn't able to go to clubs and actually do what all the songs were about. So, going back to what I said earlier about the sound of it, I was really a kid who was noticing that it was exciting. I loved the sound of it, and that sound kind of took me over. That was the most cathartic part of it, I think, was just the sound of it. This group of two records, I think, had that sound. The Stones and the Beatles, their first records just seemed to, wake something up inside of me that made me think like a musician and made me want to seek out music as primary source of life.
That seems like a good thing to do. Let's see, what would number 3 be? Where do we move from here?
Well, I had to start moving around a little bit. If I had to limit it to 10, the next really big thing that happened, of course, was Hendrix.
I was wondering when Mr. Jimmy would come into play.
Yeah, to me, his whole catalog while he was alive is, can only be taken by me as one big thing. But if I have to break it down, it's the first album. it's, hearing the first track off the first album on the radio, asking my older sisters, they would bring home, along with their boyfriends, would say, oh, here, we brought you this record, we heard you liked it. They were fascinated with the fact that some little kid was into this acid rock,
Yeah.
And so I think I was encouraged to follow this fascination, and ever since that first record, that's what really changed my mind. And by then I was already thinking, like, this drums thing is really hard. It's not working out so well. But I hadn't really made the leap into thinking that I could be a guitar player. It was it was something you wouldn't think of. I thought it was so unattainable that I just put it out of my mind.
Right.
So, but yeah, and I think I remember very clearly finally getting the album Are You Experience and trying to get through it and finding it difficult to go from, to play the whole album, because it did something to me emotionally, mentally, physically. It was like by the time I got to the third song, From the Sun, it was like, oh my God, I got to stop for 10 minutes or a day or two, and I'll get back to this one. I don't know why it affected me so much. Other people were putting it on and having a good time, and to them it was all funny music, I suppose. It was entertainment. For me, everything was life-changing. Every phrase that he did meant something, and it turned my heart upside down. And so I couldn't listen to it like a normal person. I remember thinking, like, boy, how come people just put this record on and, like, party? And when I put it on, I'm transfixed. It's like got a tractor beam on my entire soul, and I just have to pay attention to every second of it. But the end result was that I loved it like nothing else. And each record that he put out, to me, it would take forever to get through because I loved it so much. It wasn't like what was, I was hearing in the top 10 month after month, which was just drivel most of the time. It would be like, well, this music is not serious at all, and then
you're hearing Gary Puckett and things like that.
Yeah, it was fun music, and I enjoyed having fun with it. But when Hendrix came on, it was something totally different. That was like a religion to me,
Your body chemistry changes in a way you don't quite understand.
Yes, and I've never forgotten that, and I respect that when I am reminded by fans of, a record of mine or a song of mine and how it changed their life. I know exactly what they're talking about because I feel the same way about these records we're talking about today, and that stays with me, and so it must stay with my fans. We gain perspective as we gain perspective on our lives, but those moments where music means everything to us, that one song that is attached to that one moment in our lives, that's forever.
Wow, nicely said. Moving from Hendrix, from Are You Experienced, where do we go from here?
Well, this is then we get into the period there where I'm starting to be a guitar player,
okay.
And I have to mention Led Zeppelin 1 because the very first single that I actually purchased was Communication Breakdown. I remember, I don't know if I told you this story before, Joe, when we were talking about other records, but I do remember, loving that song and just thinking it was so much fun, and they just seemed like the craziest bunch of guys ever. And then I turned it over, and Good Times, Bad Times was on there. And I remember hearing that intro and getting the feeling of fear in my chest.
Yeah, sure.
As a young kid, and I was like afraid of these guys. Like, what is that? Boy, it's funny. I love that song now, and I can play it, and my musician's brain can understand it. But when it starts, for the first couple of seconds, I get that same feeling that I had when I was a young kid, and that came out, and I just remember thinking, this is dangerous music by some unpredictable people.
Yeah.
And that, what followed, of course, was that record. My sister Marion was pretty much perfect age for Led Zeppelin coming out. I remember her bringing home Led Zeppelin 1 and 2. I think she was more of a fan of Led Zeppelin 2, but I just remember the sound of that record, what Glenn Johns did, what the recording techniques that he ushered in on Led Zeppelin 1 changed, the history of recorded rock music, and he captured that band, I think, in the best possible way. It's by far, I think, the best recording of Led Zeppelin, just in terms of sonics. That's where you really feel who they really were. It just happens to be when they were at their youngest and their most free, before they really zeroed in on their special attributes.
Now you're a young guitar player when you're hearing this record for the first time and getting into it.
Not yet, because this is like '68, right? So
okay,
I'm still just a super fan, but my sister Marion is a folk guitar player at the time, so there's a guitar in the house, but I'm not really looking at it. I'm still playing piano. That's in the family room, and the drum kit is sort of gathering dust a bit. I'm not playing as much.
I just didn't know if you had a sense of Jimmy Page had a history before Zeppelin, from the Yardbirds and stuff. I didn't know if you kind of had that context in your head.
No, I was terrible at that, It's funny you should mention that, because I had friends who were good at that kind of stuff. They would connect the dots with musicians, and I can't stress enough how in the clouds I was when music came on. Like, when I started to get into these bands, I was so into the music that it never dawned on me to find out what guitar he played, what was the brand, or did he play with somebody else before then. It just never occurred to me to make any of those inquiries. I was so overwhelmed with the music that once it started, I was off in that world, and once the music ended, I was sort of recovering from the cathartic experience. Years later, as I got into bands, I realized, wow, my bandmates are like more normal people. They listen to a band like Led Zeppelin, and they find out, what cymbals is Bonham using, and when did Page use the Tele versus when he used the Les Paul, and what amps is he playing, and where can you get them? It never dawned on me to follow that path. I was always just into the music. It severely hampered my success, I think, as a young teenage musician, because my guys must have thought I was the spaciest guitar player ever.
Well, you made up for lost time.
I did. I'm still working on it. I was a late bloomer kind of guy,
Well, let's see. Moving from Led Zeppelin, where do we go for number 5 here?
Well, Sabbath had a huge impact. By the time I'm a guitar player, let's go back one more. If we're trying to go chronologically, it would be Jethro Tull, stand-up record. Something about that album, it was a record that was brought into my house. I just thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever heard in my life.
Wow!
And they wound up. I suppose by the time I heard that record, maybe it was about halfway through its cycle, and I didn't know that Jethro Tull had an earlier record. And but they were, within months, they were coming with the follow-up record, and they were going to be playing at the Westbury Music Fair. So I wound up not only having this record, but quite quickly they were one of the first concerts I got to see a rock band live, and that was a fantastic experience all on its own, just being a young kid and going to see a rock band like that at a time, again, when I have to stress this is New York. It's the late '60s. They called it counterculture for a reason. There wasn't really a lot of rock and roll going around, and there was, the young culture was kind of under siege, and they were, and each time there's a new movement in society, they really act out, and so there were extreme elements of this counterculture rock and roll happening, but the overall element that surrounded you day by day was very conservative, and it was not people didn't look like Ian Anderson in the band, and nor did they look like any of the bands that we talked about. So it was still exotic, and here again another British band. But that record I thought was so beautiful. There was something about it that I related to.
What did you think of the whole flute thing? A lot of people don't think the flute can fit in rock and roll at all.
Yeah, I loved it. To me, it was all music. I never discriminated against it. I heard it all at once. To me, it sounded like beautiful music. And, his music, I noticed that it was a little bit more deep, let's say, than the Stones. You asked me before whether I was aware of the connection between the American blues and the Rolling Stones,
yeah.
and that still really hadn't happened. That was going to happen starting with 1970 as I started to be a practicing guitar player. My older brother started making those connections for me because he would bring home blues records by American artists as he was playing blues harp, and he made me aware of the connection between those artists and the Stones and Zeppelin and even Hendrix. But Ian Anderson and Jethro Tull were different. They were more exotic. There were elements of, I would say, more Celtic roots, and there were more elements of jazz, which I definitely related to because, at the same time I was growing up listening to rock and roll, I was listening to all my parents' jazz records, and I loved them equally. So, to me, that record had some beautiful jazz-oriented music on there, and even the classical stuff. It was just deep. It was very broad. Ian Anderson was writing stuff that borrowed and utilized elements from a lot of different musical styles over the last 500 years, and I could pick up on that, and it was wonderfully done, and it had that groovy feel, that late 60s groovy feel where the guitarists were rocking, but the drummers were swinging.
I just noticed something, with the exception of Hendrix, who hails from Seattle. So far, all of your choices are British.
Yeah, very interesting, isn't that? All these artists are British, and this really speaks to the fact that this whole British invasion thing was a big deal for my older siblings. And again, they were my window into the outer world, not only with the music, but the style, and they were the reason why I started wearing crazy clothes and started growing my hair really long, because they would convince my parents that little Joey had to look cool.
That's great.
So, as they got older and put my parents through every trial and tribulations that kids should put their parents through, I was number 5, and they finally threw their hands up in the air and said, "Oh, whatever, okay, you want to wear motorcycle boots and be in a rock and roll band and play Black Sabbath downstairs, and we'll deal with the neighbors calling the cops and all that." My older siblings had beat my parents down. Let's put it that way.
That's great.
And I came along and finally was allowed to do whatever it is that I wanted to do, which was in fact just be a musician and a crazy guitar player. And so it played into seeing these to me, they were exotic bands. When Ian Anderson and Jethro Tull showed up at the Westbury Music Fair, I wish there were photographs of the audience and how different and straight they look compared to these musicians on stage.
That's great. Let's see. We move on to number 6 now. So is that Sabbath?
That would be Sabbath. That would, without a doubt, I think the first 2 records, you'd have to take them as a group, right? Because the first record, Black Sabbath, was perhaps a little short, maybe?
Yeah.
And Paranoid comes just a couple of months later. I remember when we used to hang out in friends' basements, those 2 records would play like they were one album in my mind, and then we would play a lot of the songs in my band, so in my high school band. So that became, I think, the first band that my siblings didn't bring into the house.
Oh.
This was, something that came out of just me being in just a high school kid. This was, and I think, maybe my siblings thought it was like funny kids' music.
Okay.
You know what I mean? They had moved on.
Yeah.
They were really growing up, but this was something that I could definitely relate to. There was something dark about it that us kids in the suburbs related to. I have no idea why, but we did, and it was dark. And when I just remember all these parties in somebody's basement, smoke-filled, smelling of cheap alcohol. The lights are out. They're boys and girls falling all over each other, and that music is playing really loud. That's so what could be better than that, right? So that that was a good chunk of my early high school experience, and all we wanted to do was keep that going, and then we would interject the Stones and Beatles and Hendrix and Tull and Zeppelin. It all got played. To tell you the truth, it was all part of it. But I had this special feeling about the guitar, just the fact that it was so singular and it had such a vibe to it. Up until then, I related to guitar players that were very broad in their stylistic approach. Hendrix played tons of styles.
Right.
He was acid, he was jazzy, he was bluesy, he was very authentic. Even looking at what Page had done on the first couple of records there, it was also very broad, and he had that English thing that he brought in, the Celtic vibe. You could tell there was something about it. And the Stones, were continually doing that as well. When Sabbath comes on, I hear the guitar and I go, wow, I do not really hear that Celtic thing. I don't hear, there's not like he's trying to be like Buddy Guy. I know he's playing blues riffs because that's, the first record, Black Sabbath, is so bluesy. But he's not, for whatever reason, he's not saying, look, I can emulate what we think are the coolest guys, which is what the other guys were doing. That's what Clapton was doing. He was emulating.
Right.
He's trying to show his good taste in blues guitar players. But Tony came along and just reinvented it. And in a lot of ways, I see a connection between Tony and Billy Gibbons in that they were sort of like hell-bent to reinvent, not hiding their influences, but saying, I'm going to reinvent it. Again, which is very different than a lot of other electric blues players that said, here are my influences, and I'm going to try to nail it.
And it's kind of a weird thing, because in a way, some of the other people you mentioned, as great as they are, like you said, I'm going to show you my influences, and I'm going to play like them in some fashion. Whereas with Tony Iommi, it's more like, you will play like me.
Yeah, I wonder what was going through his mind. I've never met him, but I would love to sit down and pick his brain about his enormous contribution to electric guitar and what was he thinking? Oh my God, what was he thinking?
Yeah.
And those first two records, man, that sound is so intense. It is so intense, and the production is so stripped down that you really can hear it. You really hear everybody. That early 70s, very dry approach, but I love the sound of his guitar, and his playing seems to have, it's like it's been distilled down to this very raw yet wonderfully polished thing. Maybe there's an innocence there, that I'm responding to, because they're not popular, they haven't had huge success, they're still wondering if they're going to have to get day jobs, they're starting out, so there's this, innocence to their approach of the recordings, and they're probably not in control either.
No, that's the great thing about this record, and a lot of debut records, you actually still hear the hunger in the band.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it's so, I'm just so thankful that those songs were available. They wrote those songs during that very special period because they stand the test of time. They were, in fact, extremely creative, and the recording process didn't get in the way of expressing those songs, which isn't always the case. Sometimes the recording process can get in the way of a band's true nature. But in this case, as with all the records that we've been talking about, there was a synergy, mostly, I would say, probably 100% completely unplanned, but there was a synergy between the innocence of the band and the straightforward approach to recording, usually because of a budget or something like that, right? The first record was
Absolutely.
done in 8 hours or something like that. So,
you know what that's like.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
We are up to number 7. Where we go on number 7?
All right, so we have to take some. This is where things jump forward, because I thought, well, the last thing that really screwed my head around was probably "Birds of Fire" by John McLaughlin, My Vishnu Orchestra. it was a toss-up between, stuff that Alan Holdsworth was on and John's records. But I think John presented such a monumental shift in the way that I realized music and guitar music could be presented and written and conceived, that to me it opened the door not only in the world of music, but it made me understand the power of notes and chords even more. Seeing those guys live, unbelievable. Best shows I think I've ever seen in my life were the original Mahavishnu Orchestra playing in New York. The experience of seeing those guys play at that level of musicianship with that amount of improvisation, and at the same time, John McLaughlin is just got the nastiest, out of control guitar sound ever. And I loved it because to me it was an extension of Hendrix. I love that. I love the fact that he, like Hendrix, would put together the most uncontrollable signal chain going and walk out on stage and try to wrestle with it. It was like, walking out with a gigantic snake and saying, I will now wrestle this thing to submission while the band is playing, That whole thing, I just related to that, and he seemed to be doing that. He just turned, that guitar just went to 11 immediately. But then, of course, he's playing stuff that I had been learning in my music class in high school, and that piqued my interest. I wanted to be able to improvise with, Locrian mode and Lydian dominant and all this stuff, and I love the fact that when he shifted these scales that I felt emotionally different, and I thought, he's got a handle on this, And then the time signature thing, which has never been the most natural thing for me, was very halting and exhilarating and challenging to me physically, because I'm really like, a swinging, I relate to the swinging drummer guy, the Mitch Mitchell and the John Bonham, and that's sort of like in my blood, and now all of a sudden I'm hearing Bill Cobham, he seems to be completely free. He can groove and swing, but at the same time, he can do it in 17/8, and I don't even know what that is. I wouldn't know. At that point, I'm thinking, well, what, do you count to 17, or do you break it up? Do you subdivide it? What do you do? I didn't know anyone who could help me with that either. So I was always relating to the music from the melody and the harmony, and I tried to follow the path of the message that the melody was trying to tell or to deliver. This is an important distinction, I think, in how people hear music. I've played with a lot of drummers who will listen to music and, because of their inclination, just break everything down into subdivisions that are comfortable to them. Mm-hmm. And you might say, yeah, but when they get to the G, that to me is the high point. And they look at you like, what are you talking about? It's a measure of this and a measure of this and then 4 measures of that. And they're not actually listening to the drama playing out between the melody and the harmony. And I always thought that's so interesting, that there are people in your band that will, when they put the microscope on the track, they have a different way of seeing it. They see it more as a collection of rhythmic phrases. Maybe the composer sees it more like a collection of, or one long melodic arch, with an underlining harmonic direction. Just like, a person who's a lead singer or a person who's not a musician, when they hear a song, they immediately try to figure out the lyrics,
Right, sure, yeah.
And the crazy guitar player is like, I don't know what the guy's singing, I'm just listening to the band, It's really interesting the way we all do that as musicians. We have a natural inclination towards certain elements of a piece of music that's different from our bandmates, because of the instruments that they're playing.
Now, where, how did you get exposed to Mahavishnu? Because unlike, I think most of your choices so far, you would hear them on the radio. I know you said a lot were, came from your siblings, but you would still hear them on the radio, AM and certainly the FM stations that were popping up in New York. Mahavishnu was not getting any radio play.
Yeah, I think it was a fellow musician. I can't actually remember who turned me on to that first. It could have been my brother, He could have, he was ahead of me, not only in age, but certainly in coolness. He was just, always seemed to be, you know, the guy with his finger on the pulse of where everything was going. And he would always walk in, you know, my room and say, you know, you should listen to this, you know, you little squirt. He would always blow my mind with something, and sometimes it would be John Lee Hooker, and other times it was probably him who brought the Mahavishnu in, and I'm thinking it was the second record. I don't think it was Intermounting Flame. I think I went, you know, record 2 and then record 1.
Birds of Fire, yeah.
Yeah, so it was Birds of Fire, and I still love that record. I still, you know, when I hear that title track, to me, that has all those elements of McLaughlin that I think are so outstanding. And the band is out of control. They are completely out of control in that song. And the arrangement is so rock, you know. They're like a rock band, and like a crazy rock band, you know. Like, I don't know what was going through their minds, but they were definitely excited about the noise they were creating. And like we said about the Sabbath, the recording is pretty straightforward, actually. It's just that they made such an unusual sound together. The combination of instruments and the way that they played, just, you know, Cobham and Mahavishnu together, the way they related to each other rhythmically was insane.
I have no idea where you're going to go, so what would number 8 be?
Well, okay, so I thought, okay, enough of the 70s.
Okay.
Because I thought, well, there are records that still come out that change, you know. The burden is that today I don't have as much perspective over the last 10 years as I do over the 60s. Like, I can really see that. So I thought, well, what was, you know, as I was becoming a solo artist, what were the records that really had a huge impact on me? And I would say Peter Gabriel's So
Wow.
had a big impact on me for a lot of reasons. The sound of the record, the whole point that he had arrived at this way of doing records that involved lots of overdubs spread out over time. You know, there was the early days of sampling. There was musicianship that was at a super high level. There was that big bassy sound. There were the quality of the lyrics and the stories he was telling. I thought was very just great. That's the stuff that I expected from Peter Gabriel because of his history as a solo artist and in Genesis. But this, to me, it made more sense to me because the album had a beautiful 4/4 groove to it.
Yeah.
And this is what, you know, in my early days, I had a lot of friends who were really into progressive music, and I was attracted to it, but at the same time, I never found myself putting on tricky time signature songs at the most important parts of my life, you know. I wanted to hear something that would receive me a little bit more, or that I could fall in its lap a little bit more easily. And that record, to me, had those songs that just were so comfortable physically. You know, they just had this feeling to them that, like big open arms. And yet, with further inspection, you know, with your musical microscope, you go, wow, look how they did that. Layers of this and layers of that. One drummer's playing a hi-hat, and this thing's coming from a machine, and then this other guy's playing the snare and the kick, and it was just like, oh my God. And then the lyrics, it was a great moment in time where I started to be on tour with a band, and I was out there in the world. Things were beginning to change for me, and that song, Big Time, you know, was a humorous little song for me. It sounded great, and I thought it was a great accomplishment in recorded music. It had all the elements of being a great piece of music, but at the same time, it was a great song that I would sing to myself anytime I thought I was getting ahead in the music business. It was a great way to bring myself back down to just Joe from Long Island, you know what I mean? Because it made fun of people who thought they were really all that and getting somewhere in life, and, you know, and it was a great way of shooting down pride, you know, or any of those things where you think you're really cool. And it still pops into my head, you know. It's just a great reminder of how you can't believe the hype that surrounds you sometimes.
That's fantastic. Let's see. We got two more. What's number 9 on your list?
Right around the same time, I guess. I'm picking two from the '90s: Nine Inch Nails, Downward Spiral. Bill Rhyme from Ibanez had sort of introduced me to Trent Reznor's music a record or two before then, and I think he thought I should hear what Trent was doing because he realized that I was, along with John Kunenberry, we were doing a lot of stuff where we were using automation, drum machines and sequencers along with sort of out-of-control guitars. We were trying to somehow wrestle electronic control with analog out-of-control. And so I was sort of aware of what he was doing, but it was a little bit outside of my style, I remember. But when Downward Spiral came out, I remember listening to that record almost like in the way that I had heard Are You Experience, where it was really cathartic to try to get through it. I remember like listening to it in the car and then a boom box and a stereo system, and it was like, I can't figure out like what sound system is going to make this record sound good because it's so dynamic and the sounds are so weird. And but that point in my life I was actually going very organic. I had started playing a lot of blues, and this record comes out and it really was inspiring to me. And then I heard the song Hurt, and then to me all of a sudden I went, oh my God, I don't care what this thing sounds like, listen to that chord progression and those lyrics. It really changed me a lot because it reminded me once again that the simple structure is very often the most powerful. And the simple arrangement is very often the most powerful. And I always knew that, and my records had followed that, but every once in a while you might get enamored with something that you're doing or something that you've been working on, and maybe you're losing your way a little bit with that, and then all of a sudden a piece of music comes out and you're reminded, no, this is the thing that I originally loved, which is this simple structure. And that song to me has that economy that I don't even want to use the word economy because it sort of downgrades it, but it has a purity to it. I don't think there's a note extra or a word extra in that song. It is so perfectly realized. And then, of course, the sound of it, the way he sings it just kind of, it gets to you.
Yeah, I mean, just a singular approach, to the vocals, to the sound, to the arrangements. Everything is on it that's needed, and nothing is on it that's not.
Yeah, and at the same time, nobody on the planet came up with that except Trent.
Right.
And that's, which is also pretty amazing.
Well, actually, looking at as you go through them, a lot of your choices are very, very singular presentations. Nobody sounded like this before this artist or band.
Yes, which brings me to the last one.
All right, what we got?
Which is Rage Against the Machine. The first record. I remember, hearing the first record, I remember getting hit with that thing that relates to all the other records we talked about, which was there was a unity in sound, and yet the personality of each band member was clear and well-defined and not overly fussed over. So, like the first Black Sabbath record is just like, oh my God, who are these guys and how did they come up with this? It's funny, like I remember the first thing that hit me was the rhythm of Zach's vocals. I heard that and I thought, this is like the craziest sax player I heard on my parents' jazz records.
Yeah, sure.
Like the phrasing of it, it was so deep, it was swinging so hard that when you pulled it out of the track, there was a vacuum. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I was so attracted to when all four guys were doing it. It's like when they were really laying it down. That's when I thought the magic really came to total fruition. And then of course you start to get into just from a guitar player's point of view. I was just thinking that this is a beautiful moment for somebody like Tom Morello to pop on the scene because he cut through all the clutter And there's a sort of a clutter of guitar ideas that happen from time to time.
Yes.
And then someone comes out with a sort of a new version of Pure, and it very often it's what they decide not to make part of their scene is what makes them pure. And
well,
it's the opposite of a guy saying, I can do all this, and it's sort of needed in a band where you've got a vocalist, where it's a vocal-oriented band, because you need this sort of purity of vision, I think, to cut through, to create an identity for the band that allows them to sing and write and play certain kinds of songs. So in a way, they have to be narrow. They have to narrow their focus a bit, and in so doing, they strengthen their focus. And so, of course, Morello's approach was just so focused. It was fantastic. And at the fact that he wasn't doing normal solos, right, was also really a breath of fresh air.
He told me once that now, although he can solo and play, he's a very versed guitar player. He told me that at the time his whole agenda was to be the DJ in Rage Against the Machine. It's really perfect too. Because I could see, I imagine like with any other band, you're in a band and you go to do something and the bass player or the singer goes, oh man, don't do that. I hate that. I hate when guitar players do that, Yeah.
So you can imagine those guys vibing off each other, how they, it's a volatile band, strong personalities, how they affected each other and how he arrived at that kind of a thing. Because you're right, he's a full-on guitar player. He can play anything. He's got all the facility and technique. And he had the right gear to do all of it. And he created a sound. And in a way, guitar players every once in a while, they come along and because of their attitude, they inject this new life into guitar playing, and they kind of save it for another decade or so. And he certainly did that. And I've told him that specifically because I thought it was so important. But yes, and then of course, like with the Nine Inch Nails, the subject matter and the intensity of the delivery really was, I think, very important for that moment in time. And they followed it up with great records too. They are sorely missed, to me, the original band. But yeah, so it's funny, when it's impossible for somebody like me to pick 10 records. I'd be better off if you said, Joe, give me your 500 top records.
Well, we would be here for more than the hour or so we've been chatting just now if it was 500. So, Joe, thank you very much for running down the 10 records that changed your life. You're going to be on tour, I think by the time this runs, you're going to be starting out the tour in where, France?
Yes, mid-September we'll be in France. I think we start with a good 6 in a row. So my hands will get a good workout that very first week.
It's going to be, a year on the road, 2 years? You do pretty extensive tours.
Yeah, we kind of stretch it out to about 2 years, but because I've got 2 aristocrats and a one Mr. Mike Keneally in the band, we chop the tour up so everybody else's bands can tour as well. So we usually go 8 or 9 weeks, and then we take about 2 months off. The other guys tour, and then we get back together. So but it'll be about a 2-year campaign. That sounds about right. All
right. We'll be looking forward to that and hearing, of course, a lot of great songs that we know and a lot of songs from Shockwave Supernova, the new album. So this has been Joe Bosso talking to Joe Satriani about the 10 records that changed your life.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.